On September 14, 2019, at 7:12 in the morning, Wayne Porter eased a 1998 Ford F-150 onto the grain scale outside Hastings in Adams County. Engine ticking, exhaust rough, odometer fixed at 312,440 miles because the last digit had stopped moving 2 summers earlier. The front fenders were rusted through in 2 places, the tailgate was held shut by baling wire, and 1 mirror was cracked across the middle. When he stepped down, people saw patched bib overalls, a faded brown coat with a repaired elbow seam, and duct-taped gloves tucked into his back pocket. Behind him sat a 1979 John Deere 772. Combined with faded green paint, 11,260 separator hours, and an auger wagon older than half the hired men on neighboring crews. The visual arithmetic looked simple to everyone watching. Old truck, old machine, old clothes, old methods. Around him, other operators stood beside glossy equipment with dealer decals still bright, financing packets in glove boxes, and monitors in climate-controlled cabs, tracking fuel efficiency by the minute. The man who made the room laugh was Travis Keene, sales manager at Platte Valley Ag, wearing a pressed logo jacket and clean work boots that had not met field mud that week. He called across the scale lane and offered Wayne what he called a real harvest setup. A new combine at $612,000, 15% down, 7.9% variable interest, projected monthly payments of $7,314 for 10 years. He said it loudly enough for 3 waiting trucks to hear. Wayne did not argue. He did not explain. He answered with 6 words, quiet and flat. If it is borrowed, it is fragile. Then he walked back to his machine, pulled a grease gun from a steel box, and started on bearings. That sentence was not stubbornness. It was a framework built over 40 years, $1 at a time, 1 avoided payment at a time, 1 repaired part at a time, and it began long before anyone in that scale line knew his name. By the second week of March 1973, Wayne was 21 and working for $3.10 an hour at a local implement yard, cleaning equipment, loading parts, and watching men sign notes longer than the weather forecast. He saw strong operators lose sleep over spring payments before seed went to ground. He saw variable rates move when yields did not. In 1981 and 1982, as interest pressure spread through farm country, he sat on an overturned bucket in the yard office at lunch and copied numbers from old sales sheets onto lined paper, calculating total cost instead of monthly cost. The difference disturbed him. A $96,000 machine financed over 7 years at rates that climbed past 15% could cost well above $170,000 by payoff, and that was before repair work outside warranty. He did not call it theory. He called it risk he could not control. His first land came through an auction in 1986, 80 acres west of Hastings. Thin margin ground, but contiguous with a rented quarter he already worked nights and weekends. Purchase price was $52,000 cash. He brought $31,400 from savings, sold a rebuilt pickup for $2,800, and borrowed $17,800 from an aunt at 0 interest under a handwritten agreement that required repayment in 36 months. He paid her back in 28 months by cutting custom hay in summer and doing winter welding for neighbors. That private loan remained the only personal note he ever carried longer than a season, and he treated even that as temporary instability rather than leverage. The pattern hardened into policy through the 1990s, and the numbers tell it more clearly than memory ever could. 1986, bought 80 acres for $52,000 cash equivalent, including family note repaid early. 1988, Added used grain bin and fan system for $6,400, paid in full. 1991. Purchased a second-hand planter for $3,200 and rebuilt meter drives for $480. 1994. Bought 160 acres for $118,400 cash after 2 years of retained earnings and stored grain sales. 1997. Built on-farm storage expansion, 42,000 bushels. Total installed cost, $54,300, no bank paper. 2002. Bought the 1979 John Deere 7720 for $9,750 at a state auction. Invested $3,180 in preseason overhaul. 2005. Acquired adjacent 40 acres for $46,000 from retiring neighbor, cash at closing. 2009. Purchased 240 acres from an estate for $312,000 cash during post-crisis stress pricing. 2013. Upgraded dryer controls and electrical for $18,900. Cut propane loss by measured 11.6%. 2016. Sold stored corn at $4.21 per bushel. Prepaid seed and fertilizer discount program saved $19,440. 2018. Zero term debt, zero equipment lines, liquid reserves at $413,000 across operating and reserve accounts. Each line looks plain on paper. Together, they formed a defensive architecture. Wayne never refused technology because he feared change. He refused obligations that assumed perfect weather, perfect markets, and perfect machine uptime in an industry defined by the opposite. The core tension was already visible, and everyone around Wayne could feel it even when they mocked him. One group optimized for speed using debt, while Wayne optimized for survival using ownership. By his arithmetic, the operators still farming at the end would be the ones who respected total cost instead of paint color. By August 2002, when Wayne brought the old 7720 home, the machine looked like a mistake. The unloading auger flighting was worn, separator drive belts were near the end, the cab fan worked only on one setting, and the straw chopper needed balancing. Neighbors estimated he had bought 2 seasons of headaches. Wayne parked it in a clean shed, set a yellow legal pad on the fender, and wrote out a maintenance sequence by hour interval, not by mood. Every 50 separator hours, chain inspection, tension check, bearing temperature pass with infrared thermometer. Every 100 hours, belts, feeder house slats, clean grain elevator cups, separator, grade adjustment. Every 200 hours, oil sampling, final drive inspection, hydrostatic linkage service. He kept receipts in a cardboard file box with ear tabs, then transferred totals to ledger sheets each December. The first full season with that machine, repair parts and consumables cost $4,930. Dealer estimate for a late model replacement with finance support that same year would have placed annual payment burden above $58,000, excluding insurance difference and depreciation curve. Wayne did the comparison every winter. The gap widened. Over 17 seasons, average annual major repair plus maintenance on the 7720 ran $7,860, with 3 high years above $12,000 and several below $5,000. The financed alternative he was repeatedly offered average projected annual cash outflow above $84,000 when payment, service contracts, and required coverage were included. Even with lower harvest hours, his own system preserved cash for land, storage, and working reserves. His household discipline matched the machine discipline. In 2018, his personal living expense sheet showed property tax and insurance on the farmhouse at $8,740, utilities at $4,980, food at $7,260, fuel and vehicle maintenance at $5,340, clothing and medical out-of-pocket at $6,120, church and community giving at $3,600, and miscellaneous at $4,720. Total, $40,760. He lived below $42,000 because fixed simplicity reduced forced decisions. No luxury debt, no second home, no recreational loans, no payment stack that could be weaponized by one wet harvest. He also bought differently from the prevailing culture. At consignment sales, while others bid aggressively on late-model horsepower, Wayne waited for unpopular lots that carried repairable flaws and discounted utility. In 2011, he purchased a grain drill for $400 that needed opener discs and one rebuilt hydraulic cylinder. All in restoration, cost landed at $1,120. Comparable finance new unit pricing that year crossed $42,000. In 2014, he paid $2,600 for a used header trailer, rewired lights for $180, replaced tires for $640, and ran it a decade. In 2017, he bought a backup unloading auger gearbox at salvage for $290 because he preferred redundancy in metal over urgency in paperwork. By early fall 2019, people still interpreted these choices as evidence of scarcity instead of strategy. In daylight, they joked about patched overalls and rusted panels. At dusk, they quietly asked for his bearing part numbers and grease interval chart. Wayne answered questions, then returned to work. He did not present speeches. He did not claim moral superiority. He followed the same narrow rule he had followed since his 20s. Protect the downside first, because good years arrive without invitation, and bad years do not send warning. 10 days after that scale-lane laughter, the weather stopped cooperating. Rain started that night as a steady mechanical hiss on steel roofs, then thickened into sheets that erased the road ditches and turned harvested strips into shallow brown mirrors. Wayne sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, one mug of reheated coffee, and 3 columns already drawn before midnight, acres standing, moisture range by field, and drying cost thresholds at propane prices from $1.20 to $1.90 per gallon. He penciled in a 4th column after listening to the weather radio update. Snow risk. At 6:40 the next morning, he drove the rusted Ford to Platte Valley Ag for feeder house chain links and an unloading elbow clamp he preferred to keep on hand. His coat was wet through at the cuffs. Duct tape on his gloves had darkened from rain. Travis Keene stood at the parts counter in a clean quarter-zip with dealership embroidery and a silver watch bright under fluorescent lights. Behind him, a wall screen looped financing offers in blue text. Harvest relief, skip first payment, variable rate options. 2 growers waited with him, both in new jackets from seed reps, both carrying folders thick with warranty documents. Travis spotted Wayne and smiled with the kind of practiced patience that carried an invoice behind it. He spread a rental contract on the counter and tapped the payment line with a polished pen. "You are entering a compressed season with a 40-year-old platform," he said, loud enough for the room. "This is mathematical suicide. Bridge note is 9.6%. Short term. Get through harvest alive." Wayne looked at the page without touching it. Rental unit rate, insurance rider, transport fee, fuel surcharge, damage reserve. Total projected outflow for 50 days came to $48,730 before labor. If weather narrowed further, the per-acre number worsened. "I will take the chain links," Wayne said, "and 2 clamps." Travis leaned forward. "You could lose a crop to pride." Wayne shook his head once. "Debt is not pride." The younger growers did not laugh this time, but neither of them defended him. One of them signed before Wayne reached the door. By the last week of September, Adams County had logged 8.4 inches of rain across the reporting stations, and the freeze came early enough to harden ruts before many fields had opened. The test Wayne had modeled for years arrived without ceremony. Financed speed versus owned resilience under interrupted harvest windows. What made Wayne hard to read in moments like that was that his caution had never come from fear of machinery or change. It came from one memory and a ledger habit that refused to loosen. In December 1985, he stood outside a farm auction near Juniata with $23 in his pocket and watched Harold Tim, a neighbor who had once helped his mother haul hay, sell a nearly new combine for less than the note balance because interest had climbed faster than grain checks. The family did nothing wrong in the moral sense. They worked, they planned. They borrowed at rates that looked manageable, then reset risk took over. Harold's operating line had rolled into equipment debt. Equipment debt had collided with lower prices, and one wet season converted tight margins into legal notices. Wayne saw Harold remove his own toolbox from the machine shed, set it in the back of a pickup, and close the tailgate with both hands, like he was sealing a room he would not enter again. The arithmetic from that day stayed literal in Wayne's mind. Harold had financed $286,000 in equipment and carryover inputs across notes that started near 8.2% and moved above 13% over 3 years. Annual debt service rose from roughly $47,000 to more than $71,000, while net farm income drifted the other direction. Wayne was 23, still paid hourly, and he wrote one line that night on notebook paper: "Never let payment size decide planting decisions." He did not become debt-free in one dramatic turn. He became debt-resistant through repetition. In 1987, he rented 120 acres at $78 per acre and paid on March 1st, not November. In 1989, he bought nitrogen early in a cooperative prepay at a 6% discount and saved $1,140 on one season. In 1990, he skipped a pickup upgrade and put $4,800 into a reserve envelope labeled repairs and taxes. In 1992, he turned down a variable rate operating package pitched as flexible because flexible, as he defined it, meant the bank could change its terms faster than weather changed his yield. A retired mechanic named Orville Danner sharpened that framework. Orville ran a one-bay shop with no sign and charged less than dealer labor because, as he said, overhead does not harvest corn. Wayne brought him alternators and gearboxes after shifts and listened more than he spoke. Orville's most repeated sentence was 8 words: "If you cannot fix it, do not finance it." He taught Wayne to price machinery in 3 layers: purchase plus failure points plus downtime exposure. Then compare that sum to the cost of owning older equipment with stocked parts and personal labor. In 1998, when Wayne considered trading for a newer combine, Orville made him list every sensor, controller, and proprietary component likely to fail in mud and cold. The list was long enough that Wayne folded it twice to fit his pocket. He kept the old platform. Orville died in 2006. At the funeral, Wayne stood in the back with hands clasped and said only one sentence to Orville's daughter: "He taught me to stay independent." 3 weeks later, Wayne wrote a check for $14,000 to help her settle property taxes on the shop building so she could keep it. No announcement, no plaque, just a memo line that read, Danner Shop. By October 1st, Wayne's own operation entered full contingency mode. He cut only in fields where exit routes were stable. He parked loaded grain carts on gravel before dark. He reduced daily acres to protect drivetrains and avoid getting trapped in mud that would cost more than any single day's yield gain. The 7720 was slower than modern machines, but Wayne had built a support system around that fact for 17 years. 2 rebuilt bearings sat in labeled bins. Belts hung in order on the shed wall with purchase dates written in paint pen. Fluids were stacked by viscosity and season. He even kept duplicate light harnesses because night breakdowns in wet weather punished delay. When the feeder house chain failed at 12:18 in the morning on a Saturday, he did not call anyone. He drove to the shop, opened the parts cabinet, replaced links, reset tension, greased idlers, and re-entered the field at 2:46. Total parts consumed that night, $312. Total outside labor, 0. His notebook entry was 3 words long, back by 3. The contrast widened across the county not because other farmers were careless, but because their systems had less room for interruption. Eli Jensen's 2-year-old combine threw an emissions fault and then locked into reduced power mode. The replacement module cost $4,200, but the larger number was time, 18 days waiting. Eli carried $428,000 in machinery liabilities, and his blended interest burden reset from 6.4% to 11.2% after a variable adjustment. His projected annual interest expense jumped by $20,544. He told his wife they would catch up with overtime custom work, then rain-closed fields again. Tom and Maria Bruckner were disciplined operators with good records, but they were caught in a stack they could not flex quickly. 2 leased headers, 1 finance combine, and monthly machinery obligations totaling $19,800. They had expected drying margin to cover part of that burden. Then propane prices jumped 38% during the same weather squeeze. Their planned cost per bushel for drying moved from 22 cents to 31, while moisture discounts on delayed loads eroded sale price. Tom sat in his truck one evening outside the elevator and recalculated 3 times. The result did not move. Nate Holloway had expanded acres on rented ground to chase scale, not vanity, and the plan penciled under normal timing. But his lender froze his operating line when his debt service ratio breached covenant after 2 delayed delivery cycles. That freeze meant no immediate liquidity for emergency repair and fuel overlap. He missed his crop insurance harvest deadline by 6 days, a technical detail with major consequences, and faced a claim reduction that tore through his cash planning for spring. These were not fools. They were neighbors operating inside a prevailing paradigm that rewarded speed when weather cooperated. In 2019, weather did not cooperate. 3 days later, county roads finally firmed enough for a coordinated run, and Wayne moved field to field with the same sequence each stop: moisture check, header angle, bearing temperature sweep, unload plan, exit path. He cut fewer acres per hour than anyone with late-model machines. He also kept cutting when they waited on technicians. At the elevator, settlement sheets started reflecting that difference. Wayne's deliveries were not the largest on any single day, but they were uninterrupted through closures and reopenings. By mid-October, the same clerk who used to wave him aside for larger accounts called him into the office and shut the door. 4 families had standing corn, narrowing windows, and machinery bottlenecks. Would Wayne consider emergency custom harvesting at cost terms No predatory rate, no immediate collection pressure. Wayne asked one question. Will they pay after grain checks clear? The clerk nodded. Then write 38 per acre, Wayne said. The total emergency commitment came to 1,140 acres. At $38 per acre, gross custom revenue would be $43,320, but Wayne treated it as a bridge service, not a profit center. He also fronted $27,500 for shared drying fuel to keep wet corn from being dumped at steep discounts. He documented every transfer on one-page agreements with simple language and one condition. Each recipient had to sit with him in December and build a maintenance and debt cap plan for the next season. That evening, Travis Keene drove out to Wayne's yard with another rental packet and a new urgency pitch. Headlights washed over the old combine parked by the shed, mud-caked, ladder bent slightly at the third step, paint dull under dust. Wayne stood by the shop door in patched overalls and listened without interrupting. Travis finished and held out the folder. You can still salvage this with modern capacity. Wayne set a manila envelope on the workbench and slid out 3 settlement sheets, a land valuation summary, and a current balance statement prepared for tax planning. Net worth, $6.84 million. Composition, primarily land and paid-for grain storage. Equipment lines, 0. Carryover machinery notes, 0. Travis read in silence. For the first time since September, he had no slogan ready. Wayne put the papers back in order, clipped them shut, and said 10 words. Capacity is useful. Control is what keeps farms alive. By the time the first hard November wind hit the county line, the old 7720 was fueled, greased, and ready under shed lights, and Wayne's phone had stopped ringing with jokes. Wayne pulled the shed door halfway down, left enough gap for morning light, and walked to the workbench where his ledger stayed wrapped in brown paper to keep chaff out of the binding. While wind pushed sleet against the tin roof, he added 2 new entries in block print. Feeder house chain repair, $312. Unloading elbow clamp replacement, $148. Then he drew a line under the page and wrote the figure that mattered more than either part, season-to-date harvest repair total, $6,870. That number sat beside his September reserve balance and did exactly what it was designed to do. It kept panic out of decision-making. By dawn the next day, he was in the cab again, and his arithmetic kept running even while the cylinder turned. He harvested at a pace most sales brochures dismissed, but every acre was paid-for acres on paid-for equipment, feeding grain into paid-for storage with no lender permissions required at midnight. That structure did not begin in 2019. It was an accumulation model with 46 years of repetition behind it, and when neighbors asked how he had reached a balance sheet, most never suspected. He did not answer with slogans. He answered with dates, prices, and avoided interest. 1973. Wages from implement yard and winter welding. Annual gross income, $7,940. Living with his mother, savings rate, 38%. 1974. Custom hay work added $2,180. Bought used tools for $410. No vehicle payment. 1975. Leased first 40 acres at $52 per acre. Total rent, $2,080. Net after inputs and rent $1,460. Fully retained. 1976. Grain prices softened. Gross farm margin fell. Still saved $1,120 by delaying truck upgrade. 1977. Bought used grain truck for $3,600 cash. rebuilt brakes and fuel lines for $290. 1978, emergency transmission repair on truck, $640, paid from reserve envelope, no borrowing. 1979, rented 80 additional acres, rent $59 per acre. Total rented acres 120. Year-end retained earnings $9,340. 1980. Fertilizer prepaid discount of 7.2% saved $1,006. Reserve crossed $12,000. 1981. Interest volatility increased region-wide. Wayne froze all discretionary spending and carried $14,800 liquid into spring. 1982. Bought first used corn head for $2,900 cash after post-harvest auction. 1983. Rented 160 total acres. Cut custom hay weekends. Annual net savings $11,240. 1984. Replaced bin fan motors for $1,120 instead of financing new bin package estimated at $18,500. 1985. Held cash while land prices softened. Reserve reached $26,900. Then came the acceleration years, and each step was boring on purpose. Boring scaled. Boring survived. 1986. 80 acres purchased for $52,000 using savings and short family note, repaid in 28 months. 1987. Soil amendments and tile repair $6,840. Yield lift over 2 seasons added estimated $18 per acre. 1988. Used bin and fan system $6,400. Raised on-farm storage optionality by 14,000 bushels. 1989. Machinery repairs $3,760 versus replacement quote above $94,000 financed. 1990. Corn sold in staggered lots average $2.41 per bushel, reduced basis exposure, retained $17,300. 1991. Planter purchase and rebuild $3,680 total, field performance stable, no annual payment stack. 1992. Declined variable operating package, funded inputs from retained profits, saved projected interest $4,900. 1993. 2 dry years improved margins, reserve climbed to $64,000 after tax. 1994. 160 acres purchased for $118,400 cash, no lien filing. 1995. Fence lines, drainage and access lane work $9,260, raised tenant appeal and field efficiency. 1996. Grain truck overhaul, $2,240. Extended service life, 6 seasons. 1997. 42,000 bushel storage expansion, installed for $54,300 cash, reduced harvest, basis, pressure, materially. 1998. Reserve rebuilt to $88,000 after construction year. 1999. Crop rotation shift improved input efficiency. Operating margin increased 9.4%. A primary consideration in Wayne's model was optionality at sale time. Storage changed his realized price more than speed ever could. Between 2000 and 2006, his weighted average sale improvement from delayed marketing versus harvest floor bids ran 31 cents per bushel on corn and 44 cents per bushel on soybeans across his volume. On annual marketed bushels that varied from 96,000 to 134,000, That timing edge produced six-figure cumulative gains without one additional acre rented. Consequently, he treated bins as financial infrastructure, not steel costs. 2000, reserve plus market gains pushed liquid holdings above $140,000. 2001, hedged only insured bushel equivalents, avoided overcommitment penalties in volatile weather. 2002, John Deere 7720 purchased for $9,750, preseason overhaul $3,180, total capital outlay $12,930. 2003, machinery maintenance and parts $5,420, compared with a dealer financing path estimated above $61,000 annual obligation. 2004, acquired small parcel access rights for $8,500, reduced transport inefficiency across 2 fields. 2005, adjacent 40 acres bought for $46,000 cash from retiring neighbor. 2006, net after tax and living expense retention $72,400. Reserve crossed $200,000. 2007, dryer tune and insulation improvements cut propane consumption 8.7%. 2008, commodity turbulence year, Wayne held unsold grain in aerated storage until basis normalized. 2009, estate sale, 240 acres for $312,000 cash. Purchase closed in 12 days because no financing contingency. If you want to know how one decision can compound for decades, watch what happened after that 2009 purchase. Land values recovered. Wayne had no debt drag on the tract, no adjustable note, and no refinancing event. By 2019, that 240-acre block alone appraised near $1.68 million at roughly $7,000 per acre locally, creating over $1.36 million in unrealized equity from a single stress cycle acquisition. This dynamic is why he guarded cash in good seasons. Cash was not idle to him. Cash was timing power. 2010, bin floor and sweep upgrade $11,200, lowered handling losses. 2011, grain drill bought for $400, refurbished to $1,120 all in, comparable new unit above $42,000. 2012, drought year margins narrowed but no term payments due meant zero forced liquidation. 2013, dryer control and electrical modernization $18,900, measured propane loss reduction 11.6%. 2014, used header trailer $2,600 plus $820 improvements, decade-long utility. 2015, reserve restored post-drought to $286,000. 2016, stored corn sold at $4.21, prepaid input discounts saved $19,440. 2017, salvage gearbox purchase $290 prevented peak season downtime later that fall. 2018, term debt zero, equipment lanes zero, liquid reserves $413,000. 2019 pre-harvest, net worth statement $6.84 million, mostly land and storage, machinery fully owned. By the third week of October, that arithmetic had become a quiet topic in coffee shops, where people used to talk only horsepower. Nobody suddenly admired rust. They started respecting resilience. The contrast with Wayne's neighbors was not character versus character. It was structure versus structure under stress. Eli Jensen had done what extension meetings and dealer reps encouraged for years: maintain newer fleets, reduce labor bottlenecks, Maximize acres covered per weather day. In ordinary seasons, that plan generated impressive gross revenue. His 2-year-old machine had capacity Wayne could not touch, but his liabilities sat at $428,000, and when his variable rate moved from 6.4% to 11.2%, annual interest burden rose by $20,544 before one bearing turned. He told his banker he could absorb it if Harvest stayed open. Harvest did not stay open. Tom and Maria Bruckner carried a different version of the same risk geometry. They were careful managers, strong operators, and early adopters of precision tools that had boosted yields on paper. Yet their machinery stack required $19,800 every month, whether fields were fit or not. Their drying model assumed propane near prior year averages. A 38% price jump and wet grain penalties stripped that margin. The resulting tension was brutal and familiar. Assets that looked strong in August became rigid obligations in November. Tom called Wayne one evening and said, "I did not buy toys, I bought capacity." Wayne answered, "I know." There was no judgment in it. Nate Holloway had expanded from owned core acres into high-rent tracts to chase scale economics. His projections were not reckless. They were simply intolerant to timing disruption. When delayed deliveries tripped a debt service covenant, his lender froze the operating line. That single institutional decision cascaded through fuel purchases, repair scheduling, and insurance deadlines. Missing harvest reporting by 6 days reduced his claim value, and the reduction fed directly into spring liquidity. Nate was 43, worked harder than most men half his age, and still found himself negotiating from weakness because his financing stack left no shock absorber. Leonard Pike carried the heaviest leverage of the group after expanding from 640 to 1,900 rented acres over 7 years. At peak, his annual rent commitments and machinery debt service exceeded $1.1 million before full input costs. In high-yield years, he looked like the future. In compressed weather years, the model needed flawless execution across too many moving parts. Penalties, drying overruns, and delayed quality discounts erased cash flow fast enough that Chapter 12 became his only path to preserve any operating continuity. He did not lose because he was careless. He lost because leverage scale has narrow tolerances. 3 days later, the county entered another short harvest window under gray skies and hard wind. This was the crisis phase that split fragile systems from durable ones. Moisture remained high, field access changed by the hour, and basis penalties widened at several delivery points as elevators filled with wet grain. Local propane contracts tightened, service crews were overbooked, and parts back orders stretched beyond practical harvest timelines. Operators with larger fleets had speed advantages only when fleets moved. Too many were parked. Wayne's 7720 had no emissions module waiting on a truck route and no software lockout requiring dealer authorization. It had belts, chains, bearings, and a man who stocked replacements before season. His average cut rate stayed lower, but uptime held. Over a 14-day period that included 2 weather closures, he logged 12 active harvest days and delivered each open day. That consistency kept his insurance compliance clean, preserved quality premiums where available, and gave him enough working rhythm to cover his pledged emergency acres. The market added pressure from another direction. Spot corn bids dropped while moisture discounts rose, a combination that punished anyone forced to sell wet grain immediately. Wayne's storage gave him choice. He could dry, hold, and market in controlled tranches instead of accepting distress pricing. On one batch alone, 41,000 bushels sold 46 days later at a net price improvement of 29 cents per bushel versus same-day wet delivery equivalent, adding $11,890 gross before carrying costs. Carrying cost on that volume in his own system remained modest because storage debt service was zero. Neighbors with financed bins faced a different equation. Then rates moved again. Short-term agricultural lending quotes in the region pushed higher as risk repricing spread, and renewal conversations turned tense. Producers already carrying variable notes watched projected 2020 interest line items climb while still finishing 2019 harvest. For heavily leveraged operations, that meant planning next season from a defensive crouch. Wayne planned from reserve strength. His cash, plus undrawn operating flexibility, meant he could prepay selective inputs when discounts made sense or wait when they did not without asking permission. Late one night, after unloading into his own bin line, he sat with the same legal pad from September and ran 2 columns under a single heading, Survive and Serve. Under Survive, he wrote reserve balance after repairs, fuel, labor, and drying advances. Under Serve, he wrote obligations to the 4 families whose acres he had agreed to cut, with timing keyed to their grain checks. The totals fit because his system did not leak cash into mandatory payments. That was the whole philosophy in practice. Debt-free was not a slogan painted on a shop wall. Debt-free was response capacity when the county narrowed to 48-hour chances and everyone needed one more day they could not buy. By the first week of November, the county understood the non-trivial truth hidden inside Wayne's worn coat and rusted truck. The oldest machine in the mud was attached to the most modern risk framework in town. The next morning made that truth public in a way rumor could not dilute. At 8:26, with sleet still clinging to the north side of the scale house, Wayne stepped into the elevator office carrying a plain manila envelope and a cashier's check request form he had filled out in blue ink. The scale clerk, Dana Lutz, took Wayne's form, glanced at the amount, then looked back a second time as if she expected a misplaced decimal. Requested check, $402,000. Payable to Red Willow Storage Partners, retiring operator liquidation account. Wayne did not explain the purchase until Dana asked, and even then he used one sentence. I need those bins active this week. Dana called the bank branch for same-day verification because that was policy above $250,000. She gave the account number, listened, wrote down an authorization code, and went quiet. When she printed the check, her hands slowed as Wayne endorsed receipt, folded the bank copy once, and placed it back in the envelope next to a one-page lease template. The number that had circulated as gossip now had paper behind it. Net worth on Wayne's latest tax planning statement remained $6.84 million, mostly land and debt-free storage, and his liquid position had enough depth to move $402,000 in one morning without touching operating continuity. For men whose fall had been dominated by rollover notes and rate resets, that was the revelation. The patched overalls had never signaled decline. They signaled priorities. By midday, word of the transfer moved through town without embellishment because the amount was too specific to distort for long. At the parts counter and in line at the diner, people repeated the same details. Distressed storage bought in sleet, activated immediately, then leased back below emergency market rates. The familiar sales language that had framed September conversations did not reappear. The county had shifted from debating Wayne's machine age to measuring Wayne's optionality. Now, before we go any further, if you want the exact numbers on how that lease structure kept 4 operations alive through winter, Subscribe and stay with this all the way to the final roll call, because the arithmetic from this moment is where the story earns its weight. 3 days later, the final 72-hour weather break opened under hard wind and a narrow barometric window, and Wayne ran 18-hour shifts across his own acres and the emergency acres he had pledged. He kept the custom rate at $38 per acre, even as demand pressure could have justified more, because he had set the rate on a cost basis and he did not move terms mid-crisis. On 1,140 emergency acres, gross billings were $43,320. Fuel, wear allocation, and labor equivalent consumed most of that. Net margin was modest by design. What mattered was timing. Those acres got cut before the final storm closed the county. The generosity piece that changed outcomes was not dramatic in style. It was procedural, specific, and immediate. Wayne had already fronted $27,500 for shared drying fuel when propane tightened. Now he matched that with storage access and payment sequencing built for breathing room instead of extraction. Eli Jensen received 22,000 bushels of temporary bin rights at Red Willow under a winter lease, priced at 11 cents per bushel for the season, while prevailing emergency storage offers in the area were running near 19 to 23 cents, with stricter unload penalties. On Eli's volume, the discount saved roughly $1,760 to $2,640, depending on comparison point, but the larger gain came from sale timing. With storage, Eli sold in staggered lots rather than distressed wet movement, improving realized net by an average of 24 cents per bushel on 18,400 marketed bushels after shrink and handling. Added gross value, $4,416. Combined effect with lease relief, approximately $6,176 to $7,056. Tom and Maria Bruckner needed a different bridge. Their machinery stack was the immediate threat, but they also had quality-sensitive corn at moisture levels that would be punished if they rushed. Wayne allocated them 31,000 bushels of shared space and wrote a side agreement that deferred half of their storage fee until after first-quarter grain settlement. No interest, no late penalty through March 31st. The deferral amount was $3,410. It was not charity in language. It was cash flow triage in structure. They used the breathing room to avoid forced sales into weak basis, then cleared deferred fees in full after January contracts settled. Nate Holloway's problem was covenant pressure and frozen operating liquidity. Wayne did not attempt to replace a bank line. He gave Nate a narrower tool, a zero-interest private note for $42,000, 12-month maturity, single-page terms, secured by post-harvest grain receivables rather than machinery. Funds were dispersed in 2 tranches, $26,000 for repair and field completion expenses, $16,000 for input timing and insurance compliance carryover. Nate signed at Wayne's kitchen table, and the only spoken condition beyond repayment was mentorship duty for the next borrower cycle. "You teach what went wrong," Wayne said. Nate answered, "I will." Leonard Pike was already moving through Chapter 12 filings before Thanksgiving, and Wayne treated that with sympathy, not lecture. Leonard could not be stabilized through another private production note without increasing legal and operational strain. So Wayne used the Red Willow purchase differently. He offered Leonard a management contract on throughput scheduling and maintenance at the newly acquired site for the winter and spring transition period, $4,600 per month for 5 months, with continuation option based on cooperative volume. It gave Leonard wage stability while court terms were negotiated, and it preserved his technical role in agriculture when ownership was no longer available to him in that season. If you are watching this and thinking generosity means writing checks with no framework, let me stop here and ask you something. Who has helped more over 10 years? The person who receives one dramatic rescue, or the person who receives structured room to recover and then must help the next neighbor? Wayne answered that question with contracts, not speeches. By the second week of November, the county summary confirmed Wayne as the only operator to complete 100% of planted acres before the final closure, including emergency commitments. That completion status preserved insurance compliance for every contracted family and protected quality premiums where available. The emotional reaction around town was restrained because farm communities often are, but the shift was measurable. People who had laughed at separator hours now asked for his maintenance intervals and reserve targets. Around town, people said even Travis Keene had gone back to taking notes instead of leading with payment plans. If you are learning something from this model, tap like and share it with someone who still compares machines by monthly payment instead of full life cycle cost. Because that single habit decides who gets options when weather strips the calendar down to scraps. Then came the deeper examination, the part that turns a compelling story into a defensible framework. Wayne's philosophy did not win because old equipment is magically superior. It won because total fixed obligations stayed low enough to let him deploy cash, where timing mattered most. Take the 10-year span from 2010 through 2019 and compare two plausible paths on similar acre profiles. Path A, the conventional financed replacement cycle. Wayne repeatedly declined, assumed one major combine purchase financed at market terms, related insurance and service package requirements, and periodic note-supported upgrades. Path B, Wayne's actual route, kept owned equipment with higher maintenance, paired with aggressive parts stocking, storage investment, and reserve retention. Path A estimated annual machinery payment burden averaging $84,000 when principal, interest, and required coverage were combined with variability based on reset terms. Over 10 years, direct machinery cash outflow projected near $840,000, not including major downtime costs in disruption seasons. Path B posted average annual maintenance and repair of $7,860 on the 7720 across long-run history, with elevated years and low years balancing to approximately $78,600 over a decade. Even after adding fuel inefficiency differences and incremental labor assumptions, Path B preserved well over $650,000 in cumulative cash compared with financed replacement behavior. Wayne redirected that preserved cash into land, bins, liquidity, and contingency parts. Consequently, when 2019 compressed harvest windows, he had response capacity rather than permission seeking. Now layer storage economics. Wayne's on-farm and later expanded storage network repeatedly converted timing into margin. Across a conservative blended estimate of 27 cents per bushel marketing advantage on controlled volumes averaging 110,000 bushels in selected years, timing value reached $29,700 per year in gross pricing edge. Over 10 comparable seasons, that represented roughly $297,000 before carrying and handling cost adjustments. With debt-free bins, carrying costs stayed relatively low, with financed bins at variable rates. That edge thins quickly. This is why he treated steel as optionality infrastructure. not as status. The recipient trajectories also held arithmetic discipline. Eli's 2019 crisis balance sheet included $428,000 machinery liabilities and an interest shock that added $20,544 annual burden after reset. Through asset sale, restructured terms, and lower fixed load, he reduced liabilities year by year, landing at $146,000 by 2024, with stabilized payment pressure. Tom and Maria exited high lease exposure, acquired used equipment package for $84,000 cash over staged purchases, and restored positive net income after removing the $19,800 monthly machinery stack that had been crushing flexibility. Nate shifted away from expansion rent commitments, protected owned core acres, and rebuilt working capital to $93,000, enough to absorb ordinary volatility without immediate lender dependence. Leonard, though he lost the original operation, remained current on court-approved terms while managing cooperative grain flow, preserving income dignity and technical relevance. Aggregate impact is where quiet generosity becomes systemic. Wayne's direct fuel advance of $27,500, discounted storage terms, deferred fee structures, custom harvesting at cost, and targeted zero-interest note support produced immediate relief exceeding six figures when measured against prevailing emergency alternatives and avoided distress discounts. More importantly, those interventions helped keep productive acreage under local stewardship instead of forced transfer during a weather-driven liquidity choke. Arithmetic, again, not folklore. By late November, when most postmortems settle into blame, Adams County had a cleaner lesson available in plain sight. The man in the rusted truck had not been resisting progress. He had been prepaying resilience for 40 years, then spending that resilience on other people when the window narrowed. By late November, when most postmortems settle into blame, Adams County had a cleaner lessons available in plain sight. The man in the rusted truck had not been resisting progress. He had been prepaying resilience for 40 years, then spending that resilience on other people when the window narrowed. In the week after that realization, he sat at his kitchen table on 4 separate nights, one family at a time, with a yellow pad, a calculator, and copies of their own numbers spread between coffee rings and moisture tickets. By mid-December 2019, Eli Jensen's plan was written in 12 lines. Sell one late model header for $118,000. Liquidate a backup tractor he barely used for $64,500. Apply all proceeds to variable machinery notes carrying 11.2%. Refinance the remaining balance into a fixed 5.1% schedule with a shorter term and no balloon. Eli started at $428,000 in machinery liabilities. After those 2 sales and principal paydown from the winter grain settlements, he entered 2020 at $233,700. His annual interest burden dropped from a projected $47,936 to $11,919. The relief was structural, not emotional. He slept again because the math stopped chasing him every morning. Tom and Maria Bruckner faced contract penalties if they exited leases too fast, so Wayne pushed them toward sequence instead of panic. Keep one lease through term end. Negotiate early return on the second header with a lump sum settlement. Replace both with older, serviceable equipment bought in cash over 2 quarters. Their lease stack had been costing $19,800 per month. The negotiated unwind cost them $36,400 in total penalties and fees, painful but finite. They covered it through grain timing gains, one discretionary land rent reduction negotiated with a longtime landlord, and a machinery auction sale of underused attachments that brought $22,300. By September 2020, they had assembled a paid-for package for $84,000 all in. Their annual fixed machinery burden fell by more than $180,000 compared with the previous cycle. They did not celebrate publicly. They simply stopped bleeding. Nate Holloway used Wayne's $42,000 zero-interest note exactly as written and repaid it in 11 months, 1 month early, with a cashier's check and a handwritten thank you that was only 14 words long. More important was what came next. Wayne made Nate build a covenant-safe operating plan with lower rent exposure and higher owned acre priority. Nate released 310 rented acres that had looked profitable in spreadsheets, but consumed too much working capital under delay risk. He sold one finance sprayer and contracted custom application instead. By March 2021, his lender reopened a smaller line with tighter but manageable terms because his debt service ratio had moved back inside covenant. By 2024, his working capital sat at $93,000, and he had not missed one insurance reporting date since the 2019 breach. Leonard Pike's trajectory required the most humility from everyone involved because there was no path back to the exact operation he had built. Wayne never pretended otherwise. Leonard worked the Red Willow management contract through spring, then helped transition the site into a cooperative flow model tied to local producers who needed flexible storage slots. His compensation moved from $4,600 monthly contract pay to a salaried role at $78,000 per year, with performance bonuses linked to throughput efficiency and shrink control. He remained current on his court-approved Chapter 12 plan, and by 2023 he had paid down enough obligations to stabilize his household without reopening speculative acreage expansion. He lost his original farm. He kept his standing. 3 months later, in March 2020, Wayne formalized the Harvest Bridge Fund with $1.2 million set aside in a separate account structure, zero interest, 12-month notes capped at $75,000, and one binding condition for every borrower. Mentor the next borrower through maintenance scheduling, storage discipline, and written debt limits. The first cycle issued 9 notes totaling $486,000. 7 were repaid within 12 months. 2 were extended once by 90 days after documented weather losses, both repaid in full. No defaults. Administrative costs were kept under 1.4% because Wayne used one-page agreements and local bookkeeping rather than layered legal overhead. By harvest 2021, the multiplier effect was visible in acreage continuity. The 4 original families plus 5 second-cycle borrowers represented 6,740 acres, still operating under local control that might otherwise have fractured into forced sales or absentee restructuring during 2 volatile years. At a conservative $7,100 per acre regional valuation, that land base represented nearly $47.9 million in productive assets, stabilized by a fund that began with $1.2 million and strict repayment discipline. That is what structured generosity can do when it is paired with accountability. Travis Keene watched all of this from the edge at first, still wearing dealership branding, still speaking in payment language, but with less certainty each season. The decisive turn came in 2022 during a winter clinic where he presented a financing promotion to a room that now asked different questions: total life cycle cost, variable rate sensitivity, downtime dependency, software lock risk, salvage value under stress. He had answers for monthly payment. He did not have answers for fragility. Within 6 months, he left commission sales, opened a used equipment brokerage in Hastings, and rebuilt his pitch around full-cost sheets that listed purchase price, likely failure points, parts availability, independent repair feasibility, and 5-year cash exposure under rate shifts. He began every consult with one line, "Let us price risk before paint." He later said without defensiveness that Wayne Porter had corrected his assumptions. In practical terms, that admission changed deals. Farmers who walked into his office with thin reserves were now steered toward lower fixed-cost equipment paths more often than financed prestige purchases. Travis still sold newer machines when the balance sheet justified it, but urgency language left his vocabulary. His business survived, smaller in volume, steadier in trust. If you have stayed this far, subscribe now for more stories where arithmetic, not image, decides who keeps the farm. Then watch how this one closes, because every name deserves an outcome, not a footnote. By the second week of October 2024, 5 years after the storm sequence that exposed everyone's structure, Wayne's own operation remained plain from the road and formidable on paper. The 1998 Ford F-150 still carried rust on both fenders, and the odometer still read 312,440. He had replaced brake lines, front shocks, and the starter over time for a combined $1,940 in parts. The tailgate still used baling wire as secondary insurance even after a hinge repair. The truck remained a working tool, not an identity project. The 1979 John Deere 772. O still entered each season from a clean shed and returned to that shed every night it ran. Separator hours had climbed past 12,000. Wayne's annual maintenance average remained under what many operators spent on one major in-season service call. He had added a second backup parts cabinet in 2022 and labeled every shelf by failure priority. Still running, still earning, still paid for. Dana Lutz, the scale clerk who printed the $400 $2,000 check, became operations supervisor at the elevator in 2023. She now required her junior staff to log not only delivered bushels, but also moisture, timing, and storage flexibility notes because she had watched one farmer's optionality preserve quality for multiple families. She said Wayne taught the office that throughput is not the same as resilience. Eli Jensen, now carrying $146,000 in total liabilities, kept one newer machine and one older backup, both sized to his acreage reality. He joined the Harvest Bridge mentoring rotation and taught younger operators how interest resets can erase yield gains if fixed costs are oversized. Tom and Maria Bruckner posted positive net income 3 years in a row, rebuilt emergency reserves above $120,000, and added their daughter to payroll after she finished an agricultural business degree. Nate Holloway stayed disciplined on core-owned acres and turned down 2 expansion leases that would have strained his buffer. Leonard Pike continued managing cooperative grain operations and became the person younger members called when they needed blunt advice about leverage tolerance. Harold Tim, whose auction in 1985 had shaped Wayne's earliest debt rule, passed away years earlier, but his family's name returned in a quieter way. In 2021, Wayne sold one small parcel edge to Harold's grandson at below market terms with no carrying interest for 18 months, provided the grandson completed a maintenance apprenticeship through the fund's mentorship track. He did. He paid. Orville Danner remained present as a principal more than a memory. The old sentence from the one-bay shop circulated through Wayne's borrower meetings, handwritten at the top of each maintenance worksheet. If you cannot fix it, do not finance it. Orville's daughter kept the building, rented part of it to an independent mechanic, and never forgot the $14,000 check that had arrived without ceremony. Wayne's own living sheet barely moved. In 2024, total personal expenses were $41,830, including taxes, utilities, food, fuel, clothing, medical out-of-pocket, and giving. Land under his control, all debt-free, was valued near $9.7 million at prevailing local estimates. He did not change his coat to match that number. He changed bearings, cleaned bins, and answered calls when someone needed a second set of eyes on a debt stack. For all the county talk about his net worth, his real legacy sat in replication. Borrowers from the first 3 fund cycles mentored later borrowers. Maintenance logs became standard practice in more shops. Reserve targets were discussed alongside yield targets. Dealers began hearing better questions. Banks began receiving cleaner projections from clients who had learned to model bad weather first. One farmer's discipline had become shared infrastructure. If this story clarified something you have felt but never named, subscribe for the next one now, because this channel documents the same pattern across different counties. Leave a comment with one specific number you track on your own operation that most people ignore. Share this with the person in your life who is one signature away from confusing capacity with resilience. At dusk that evening, after finishing a routine grease pass, Wayne shut down the 7720 and sat for a moment in the open cab door while starlings crossed above the bins. The shed lights caught faded paint, worn steps, and steel polished by decades of use. Outside, the old Ford waited by the same gravel lane, plain as ever. No reveal was left. No argument was needed. In Adams County, the farmer who looked poorest had been richest where it counted, in margin, in patience, in options, and in the willingness to spend those options so other people could stay on their land. Wayne climbed down from the cab, closed the shed door the rest of the way, and set the grease gun back on its hook, beside the same yellow legal pads he had used through the 2019 storm season. He did one more thing before turning out the light. He opened the fireproof cabinet by the bench and checked the folders in order: settlement sheets, Red Willow lease copies, Harvest Bridge notes by borrower year, and the bank carbon copy for the $2,000 cashier's check that had changed how the county talked about risk. Then he latched the cabinet and walked toward the old Ford. Tailgate wire still looped tight. Odometer still fixed at 312,440. 6 weeks later, on a hard, cold evening in January 2025, his kitchen table held 9 chairs and 3 calculators. Eli Jensen arrived first with a 3-ring binder and a thermos. Tom and Maria Bruckner brought printed machinery logs. Nate Holloway came with soil maps and a debt worksheet already highlighted in 2 colors. Leonard Pike carried throughput reports from the cooperative site and a legal pad folded in half from use. Dana Lutz came after her elevator shift with the moisture ticket summaries and scale flow charts. Nobody dressed for ceremony. They came in work coats, boots drying by the door, hands rough from winter maintenance. Wayne stood at the table head for less than a minute. "We start with numbers," he said. "Then we eat." Donna read the Harvest Bridge ledger out loud while Eli checked entries against digital copies. From spring 2020 through fall 2024, the fund had issued 31 zero-interest notes totaling $2,036,000. 29 were repaid on original schedule. 2 were extended once by 90 days after documented weather losses and repaid in full. Defaults, 0. Administrative cost across 5 years, including bookkeeping and filing fees, 1.6%. Mentorship sessions completed, 31 out of 31, because repayment terms required attendance and signed maintenance plans for the next borrower cohort. The multiplier was no longer abstract. Of those 31 borrowers, 24 were still independently operating in 2025 on a combined 18,460 acres of owned and long-term family-held ground. At a conservative regional valuation averaging $7,850 per acre across those tracts, the land base remaining under local control represented roughly $144.9 million in productive assets. Wayne never claimed he preserved all of it by himself. He did not need to. The fund had provided timing, and timing had prevented forced exits at the worst moment. Eli spoke next and kept it plain. I used to chase annual acres. Now I chase fixed cost ratio. He slid one page to the center. Machinery liabilities were down to $146,000, unchanged from the prior year except for normal amortization. Interest expense for 2024 had been $7,446, down from crisis-era projections above $47,000. He had rebuilt prepaid input discipline and carried 6 months of household expense in cash. Then he tapped the line item that mattered most to him. No variable resets. Tom and Maria followed with their own sheet. Paid for equipment value on hand, $96,300, bought over time and maintained in-house. Monthly machinery obligation in January 2025, $0. Their 2024 net farm income remained positive for a 4th straight season, and emergency reserves stood at $137,000 after tax. Maria pointed to a second document, a mentorship schedule they now ran for younger operators on part stocking and lease exit arithmetic. We teach the penalty math first, she said. People need to see the whole bill before they sign. Nate set his covenant worksheet on top of the moisture maps. Debt service ratio is inside limits with room now, he said. Working capital at year-end sat at $108,000, above his 2024 target. He had kept owned core acres and refused 2 new rent offers that would have looked attractive in a normal weather forecast, but violated his cash buffer rule. Wayne nodded once and wrote one line in the margin of Nate's page. Discipline under opportunity is the real test. Leonard waited until everyone else finished. He had learned not to hurry his words. Cooperative throughput at Red Willow had risen 14.2% year over year, shrink was below benchmark, and the site had finished in the black with a reserve contribution for maintenance. His Chapter 12 plan remained current. No missed court-approved payment. He still missed his original farm, and he said that without shame. But he also said he had stopped measuring worth only by owned acres. I am still in agriculture, he said. I am useful. That counts. After the meeting ended, Wayne pulled out one final folder and handed copies around the table. It was the same maintenance checklist that neighbors once copied quietly at night in 2019, now updated through 2024 with revised hour intervals and parts numbers. The feeder house chain links, unloading elbow clamps, duplicate light harnesses, and bearing temperature routines were all there, each item tied to a specific failure lesson and replacement cost. What had once been one farmer's notebook had become shared operating doctrine. In March, at a regional equipment risk clinic in Hastings, Travis Keene stood behind a folding table without dealer branding for the first time in years. The sign over his booth read, Keene Equipment Brokerage and Life Cycle Cost Analysis. His display did not lead with monthly payment cards. It led with side-by-side 5-year cash exposure sheets. Purchase price, estimated interest path under fixed and variable assumptions, downtime sensitivity, independent repair feasibility, parts availability lead time, and resale downside under stress. Wayne came in late, cap in hand, and stood in the back while Travis answered questions from a room full of producers who had changed their own standards since 2019. A younger operator asked why Travis now pushed used units so often. Travis did not dodge, because capacity without resilience is a trap, he said. I sold urgency for too long. Wayne Porter corrected my assumptions, and the county paid tuition for that lesson in one wet fall. His brokerage numbers were smaller than his commission years had been, but the business was steady. He closed fewer deals with lower margins per transaction, and saw fewer repossessions tied to customers he advised. He had also started declining sales when a buyer could not show reserve depth. That decision cost him volume and bought him sleep. In private, he told Dana he wished he had changed sooner. She told him sooner would have been better, but changed is still changed. By the first week of October 2025, the roll call sat fully in view. Wayne was 74, still living under $42,000 a year, still debt-free, still parking the 1979 7720 in a clean shed each night of harvest. The truck remained rusted and mechanically sound enough for local runs, with the cracked mirror replaced once, and the baling wire tailgate backup still in place out of habit. Dana was now elevator operations manager and had built a weather interruption protocol that prioritized moisture transparency and small operator scheduling fairness, a direct callback to the bottlenecks she had watched in 2019. Eli mentored new borrowers every winter and required each one to model interest rate shocks before choosing machinery. Tom and Maria expanded only on owned ground, never lease stacking again, and their daughter handled grain marketing with storage-first discipline. Nate kept covenant-safe planning, filed every insurance report ahead of deadline, and carried backup parts inventory by category, not by guess. Leonard remained cooperative site manager, earned a performance bonus for throughput efficiency, and had become the first call when someone needed hard truth on leverage. Harold Tim's grandson completed his maintenance apprenticeship, paid off the below-market parcel purchase under the agreed terms, and now ran that ground with no equipment note larger than one season. Orville Danner's daughter still held the old shop building. The independent mechanic tenant had expanded to 2 bays and trained apprentices using the same worksheet, heading Orville once repeated, "If you cannot fix it, do not finance it." The one-page agreements Wayne used in 2020 were now archived in labeled binders in the fireproof cabinet. Every note marked paid, extended then paid, or closed by transfer terms with signatures and dates. Nothing left unresolved, nothing left to rumor. On a clear evening after corn came out dry enough to reduce dryer load, Wayne finished a final bearing pass, shut off the shed lights, and listened to the quiet settle over bins he owned outright. No audience stood there. No argument remained to win. The arithmetic had already delivered its verdict across names, acres, and years. The man who looked poor had carried the deepest margin of safety. The oldest combine had finished when speed systems stalled. The cash he preserved had become other families' breathing room. And in Adams County, where weather still made promises it did not keep, the philosophy endured because it was measurable, repeatable, and kind.